when talking about different assets all over the world, of course, Asia is an important part, especially when Asia Pacific is with various different countries, like in China, Korea, Japan, and also Singapore. I get to know Mark during the pandemics, actually, and then of course I visited Singapore, but you could see the similarities right there. But of course, you should also appreciate the differences also right there. During the pandemic, people have different ways to see the role of AI and to see how AI can contribute to and also can bring negative side effect to COVID, the fighting against COVID. This is our recent discussions with Mark in such a nice way in the Asia Pacific network. Mark initiated many discussions related to this and wanted to contribute the Asia Pacific view to the world with participation from Singapore, of course, but also from China, Japan, and Korea, and many other countries. So I'm really grateful that Mark could join us together. Most recently, we were in the same in the same collection of fighting against AI, fighting against the COVID by using AI from different perspectives. And I'm grateful to learn about the Singapore approach from Mark. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yi. You'll have to forgive me if I sound a bit croaky, but I've just had a tonsil removed a few days ago, so my throat is rather uncomfortable. The thoughts that I would put before you grow out of the experience of our research in Singapore, rather than necessarily telling you about the Singapore approach, because the Singapore approach in many ways with their model framework is similar to so many other countries that have a top-down compliance process based on ethical principles, which organizations, companies, public sector administration agrees are worthy, and they are said to comply to them. Much of the work that we've done on ethical impact is at the other end of the food chain. We look at the designers, the young AI professionals in the ecosystem, and ask, what is the influence of ethics on them? Do they understand the ethical language? Do they embody ethical principles in the work that they do? And realistically, the results of the work that we've done are really quite alarming, because in many respects, the people who are involved in that frontline work are more influenced by the pressures of externalities like client need, market price, those frameworks which seem to work against even the opportunity to pause and think ethically about the way in which we design AI and the way in which we take it forward. So one of my arguments about let's say the active relevance of ethics is the way in which it really gets down into the areas of the design system where those who are creating what we want to be ethical have the space, particularly the safe digital space, to be able to consider these things. Let me go back a step and say, why is it that we want AI to be ethical? We don't want our washing machine to be ethical. We don't want our motor vehicle to be ethical, but we want AI to be ethical. AI as a technology, AI as a learning process, AI as an algorithm, AI as a data consumer. And the reason why we want ethics to be, why we want AI to be ethical is because we don't trust it. Even the designers don't trust it. I've been working recently with the National Robotics Program in Singapore, and the attitude of the technical community is somewhat at a loss about ethics, except in terms of safety and robustness. They're the limits of what their concerns might be. If we think about ethics as a regulatory framework in the current AI atmosphere, much of the language of ethics has been compromised because it grew out of the interests of big technology. So one of the reasons I think that big tech is so much in favour of ethics as a self-regulatory framework is because they help create it. And I'm often mindful of the fact that when we're considering the objects of regulations, such as those who promote and sponsor AI, we need to think more clearly about their involvement in the regulatory frame. More recently, if you think about the way in which ethics has been somewhat disappointing as a regulatory option when we look at the control of personal data use in surveillance technology in relation to the pandemic, I would say that in many respects, a simple reliance on ethical principles really hasn't protected the rights of the individuals in the way that we want. And therefore, the next question that comes from that is, what can we do to assist ethics becoming more, let's say, vigorous and applicable in those areas of particular crisis? I would, yes, I think perhaps it was somewhat of an understatement, but I'd like to move from that and say the work that we've been doing on the relationship between ethics and rule of law is one process that helps, if you like, conceptualize ethics in a stronger framework, because rule of law gives enforceability, it gives institutional grounding to ethics, which I think is a positive direction. The problem, however, with the reliance on rule of law as well is that to some extent it is as slippery as ethics is in a language. And so while I think rule of law does add some interesting concepts, it doesn't necessarily solve the deficiencies of a self-regulatory ethical framework on its own. So is the answer to this, to it, particularly from a cultural perspective, an answer to this to give more voices to the ethical dialogue, so that we need to have, for example, an Asian concept of compassion? Should we have Sun Yat-sen's concept of brotherhood? Is it necessary to introduce not just culturally relative language, but culturally relative understandings? I think that's a step in the right direction, but I don't think, again, that to descend into cultural relativity would be sufficient on its own, because we would lose in doing that some of the universal values that we think global regulatory frames should ascribe to. So I was talking, and I'll conclude around these themes. I was talking recently at a meeting of individuals who are involved in standard setting, who are involved in legal regulation, and who are involved in compliance. And a number of those were particularly enthusiastic about the EU AI legislation which is proposed. And I had to challenge them by saying, look, most of the energy that you're placing on this discussion is an energy directed towards the minimization of risk. So it's all about looking from the door of the laboratory into the process of design. You're not really engaging with the community out there where AI is going to be deployed. And if the community is left out of that discussion, what ethical priorities do we want for the design of AI? Then there's going to be much less trust in a deployment world where that bridge has not been created. And I think, interestingly, particularly if you look at the rollout of robotics, which is very actively being pursued across Asia, I don't believe that it's sufficient simply to say to the community that will be receiving robotics, AI-driven robotics, look, this has a 5-star rating. It's reached the best standards, so you just don't need to worry about trust or otherwise, because we're assuring you that this is a quality product. In conclusion, let me just raise 2 points that we've been working on to try and overcome this problem. One is the concept of AI in community. And I'm somewhat uncomfortable talking about cross-cultural engagement, because culture is such often a notion which is demonstrated rather than real. But when you're talking about communities, actually communities who are receiving the benefits or otherwise of the deployment of artificial intelligence, then you've got perhaps a clearer empirical background to look at the concepts of trust. The idea of community that we work with is Roger Cottrell's idea, which is a series of relationships of trust, bonds of trust between humans, between others that exist, institutions that exist in the community. And the argument that we put is that AI can be part of that trust relationship if it's located within communities, and communities have some priority in being able to argue for purpose and for ethical priority. Now, again, one might say, well, that's a rather ideal notion of community, but I challenge that. I think that in fact, where AI is being deployed, whether it's being deployed in the healthcare sector, whether it's being deployed in educational frameworks, wherever it might be, there are real communities that come into contact with it. And those communities will either establish bonds of trust with AI or they will not. Now, those bonds of trust can be, let's say, encouraged and enlivened by assurances about ethical compliance, but that's not enough on its own. There has to be a realization that there is a conversation between the community and AI proponents, AI sponsors, around those issues which they consider to be most important. I'll just give you one quick example before I finish, and that is recently in Singapore, Singapore is largely constructed around public housing. About 85% of Singaporeans live in public housing estates that are managed and looked after by the state. In one of these large estates, it was decided that it would be important, useful, a good idea to introduce infrared sensors. The infrared sensors were supposed to look after the elderly if they fell down in the bathroom or whatever it might be. They weren't going to be used to identify domestic violence, which we suggested might have been an equally important thing for the technology to do. But they were there largely to enable older people to live on their own. What was the reaction? The reaction of people in those housing estates was extremely negative. They didn't take the assurances of the state that this is really good for you and this technology won't harm you and the data will be kept private and all of these things are going to be to your advantage. No one talked to them. No one sat within that community and said, what ethical elements do you want this technology to operate on? Now, the primary ethical element that people wanted in that situation was personal integrity. They didn't want a sensor in the bathroom. They're happy to have a sensor in the kitchen. Now, this sounds very simple, but it's profoundly important because I guarantee the designers of those sensors were aware of ethical principles and were most probably designing their technology and using their data in a way which you would consider to be against that measure ethical, but the community had no part in this. And I think when we're talking about cross-cultural collaboration or whether talking about global collaboration, we can reduce it right down, I think, to communities who will or will not benefit from the introduction of AI. And let's face it, one of the biggest problems with AI is the fact that communities oppose it because they misunderstand it. They think the risk is something which it is not. And we can't simply turn around and say, well, you know, you're ignorant, so forget about it. I recall the work that Yi is doing in relation to the SDGs and the importance of the SDGs as a, if you like, a partner to the introduction of AI. I can see this as being very powerful and important, but I can also see it as an example of techno-colonialism. And if we're not careful about the way in which technology is introduced into communities, particularly communities that are vulnerable or come from economies that are perhaps less able to counterbalance the power of the technology, we simply create another relationship of dependency. And that relationship of dependency, I suggest, is not what we're talking about with trust. So I'd conclude my thinking on the basis that I believe that collaboration around ethical principles and an attempt to embody and imbue ethical principles into every aspect of deployment is hugely important. And I think that can be done on a neighbourhood basis as much as a cultural basis, a state basis, or a multinational corporation basis. If you're interested in some of our work, you might also be interested in the stuff that we're doing on digital self-determination, which I don't have time to talk about now, but is an example of the way that people, data subjects in communities, can have some say about the principles that govern the way in which their data is accessed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing the perspective of community in the context of cross-cultural collaboration, and also your view on pros and cons for introducing AI to SDGs, which is really much appreciated, which I hope that we can extend the discussion.